You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avram Kivelevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode. If it's Erev Shabbos Kodesh, this must be Rischa D'Oraisa. This week, my friends, on Chav Daled Shvat, marked the 100th birthday of Rav Moshe Sternbuch Shlita. And a video circulated that I shared with my friends, Rav Meir Schiller and Rabbi Yosef Gabriel Bechhofer, a video of Rav Sternbuch receiving birthday greetings from King Charles and Carmilla. It's available on matzav.com and many other places where you could see it. And it's supposed to be able to live to be 100 years old. And Rav Sternbuch is clearly a figure that has been poil mightily in his 10 decades. And I want to dedicate today, as Lekovidim, to speak about Rav Sternbuch's contributions, Klal Yisrael, in his writings and his Hanhoga and his Shitas and Ashkofa. And some of you will say, well, he's not dead yet. But the truth is that the Netziv has a Yesod that when we say, when you're maskir as someone, Achar Misa, Sifsoisav, Doivavos V'kever, he says, Alachos Kama V'kama, when they're still alive, that's Sifsoisav, Doivavos. That it isn't just a din after you die when we mention your Torah and your ideas, that there's some sort of Isaiah, some sort of, the Nefesh gets some sort of Eloi out of that. It's even Kal V'chaimer, the Netziv says, B'chayav. And we can talk about him, and hopefully it will be a great birthday gift indeed, to say over his Torah, to have that schus of Sifsos of Doivavos, because I'll tell you right now, it looked like Sifsos of Doivavos on these videos. I saw his lips moving, but I don't know if it was necessarily with Havana, and we've talked about this in the past. And before we get to Rav Sternbuch's Chashivos, let's talk a little bit, Rav Meir and Rav Yosef, about the videos, the images we've seen about Rav Sternbuch. My feeling is it does him no honor to trot him out with the oxygen mask and having him sort of like barely seemingly understand what's going on.
Well, we do have examples of this in recent Jewish history. Lubavitch comes to mind, the Vision Rebbe of Moshe comes to mind, in which these leaders were brought out.
Kanievsky.
Exactly, right. In what is either a symbolic fashion, or maybe some would argue that they still perform some ruchnistic function beyond the level of consciousness. So it's not atypical. They did bring Woodrow Wilson to the streets of Washington when he was long since unaware of where he was and perhaps who he was. My own personal feeling is maybe from a distance, but once you engage the person in conversation, it gets a little disconcerting, maybe from a distance as a symbolic figure.
You'll be Moichel the Kesher, but what was the name of the Pope who resigned? Benedict?
Yeah.
And I thought that at the time was a message for us, that when a person felt that they didn't have necessarily the mental and physical capabilities to serve in that role, that a pension is fine. Rabbi Bechhofer and I spoke before you joined us as a threesome here about some of the pronouncements of Rav Sternbuch, where he couldn't even hear properly, and whatever he was being told, and his responses were then emblazoned as a sign of charama and isser against certain things that are going on. He's still technically the Av Bezdin of the Eidach Haredis, at least according to some shitas, right? And therefore, you would think he still has that role. To me, it makes sense, Rav Meir, that to be mechabed him, and that's what we're going to try to do today, to mechabed him of what he accomplished. But as Alzain Shaina pensioner legamri, this idea of keeping him in this role and saying, what's the psak of Rav Sternbuch, and let's go to Rav Sternbuch for him to give us the Das Torah and the psak and the Isser, it seems to be laughable.
In the Eidach Haredis, there used to be, I don't know if there's a difference anymore, there used to be between the Ravid and the Gaivid. And one of them was the actual head of the Eidach Haredis, the other was a titular head. Rabbi Sternbuch is the figurehead. So I think the Ravid, even though Rabbi Sternbuch, because of his stature, is of course a very active posek, he wasn't put there in that position. He was put there to be the figurehead, and particularly since he is the Litvak. And traditionally, the Ada, even though they're Hungarians, they liked having Litvaks at the head. In that role, it's not so important that he actually be fully functioning. He's a figurehead. Just it's very appropriate that King Charles, who's a figurehead, is sending a message to the Rabbi Sternbuch, who's a figurehead, right?
Very good, very good. But I think you agree with me that bringing out these videos that show a person who's doesn't seem to chop.
Yeah, they shouldn't do videos. The videos, I agree.
To ability to make shalom with the matzav and recognize where you're at. This is part of what all human beings need to realize. Again, I quote Benedict, but everybody really has to come to that. And the people around him do no service to someone when they're trying to prop up something that's really not there. And let's talk about Rav Sternbuch's contributions. He is a extremely prolific writer.
Shlomo Zalman said, I think this is the Yisod for Rabbi Sternbuch. If Shlomo Zalman or Rabbi is supposed to have said this, I heard from Rabbi Schlesinger. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, why is the Shev Shmaitza such an enduring sefer, such a classic? Because you can argue on everything he said. And this is true, because the Shev Shmaitza serves as a springboard for a lot of advanced and independent thought. And it's one of these, I think, the Kilos Yaakov is very similar sefer. You can argue on every Kilos Yaakov, and that's what makes a great sefer. And I think the Moadim Uzmanim is the perhaps even greater example of that. You can argue on every single thing the Moadim Uzmanim says. There are a lot of havrakas there, and a lot of wild havrakas. And you can argue, I'm sure, as Rebbe Avraham probably has given many chaburas in his lifetime, which has taken the Moadim Uzmanim to task and made, as they call it, Asham Blotta out of what he said, right?
One of Rav Sternbuch's, I guess, elements of genius in terms of writing was that he was able to write Sfarim that were niskabel because there was enough of an achiza there, and yet you would end up not just saying, be makabel my das, but you would actually say, wait, I'm not sure if I go all the way with you. And I think you're correct. It really, I have to be makar tov that when I was about 15, either 14 or 15, I was introduced to the Moadim Uzmanim.
Okay, I have to, wait a minute, I have to play Kivalevitz here. I have to do Kivalevitz. Note Rabbi Say that Rabbi Avraham at the age of 15 was a tremendous Eli already.
No. All I'm saying is that I grew up in Memphis. I was introduced to the back of the Gemara when I came to yeshiva in Ner Yisrael in 13. But and I was already used to learning whatever the Achrayna Shared was, but a sefer that was not part of our Gemara learning. And I liked it. And I didn't need a tremendous bikiyas to be able to be coy with it. You didn't have to open up 10 other Meir Mekaymis to understand what he was doing.
And he brings out enough Meir Mekaymis that you can use to argue on him.
That's right. And he has, you've got to admit, a fluid style. He has an elegant pen, at least in his rabbinic world. You know what he's after, and you know what he's about.
Can I be masked here? One of my favorite Kedushim Rebbe Sternbuch, which again, I think is very funny. He says about the international date line. That the international date line, he says, there's Machlekes of Chaim, not Chaim, but Chuchinsky and Chaznish, whether it's 9 degrees east of Yerushalayim or 808 degrees east of Yerushalayim. So he says, Yesh Liashe. In the northern hemisphere, it's 90 degrees east of Yerushalayim, because all the poskim who spoke about it speak about the northern hemisphere, and then we have to be machriya in the Chazonish. In the southern hemisphere, they didn't speak about it because nobody lived in the southern hemisphere. So therefore, in the southern hemisphere, we could pass it as 180 degrees east of Yerushalayim. So according to him, the Kavatarich goes 90 degrees, then makes a 90-degree turn, and then he goes into 180 degrees away from Yerushalayim. Now, it's a brilliant insight.
Scientifically, totally upgefragt and makes no sense.
Yes, but that's the thing. You could sink your teeth in that. You could say, it's a springboard for thought.
And he inventively allowed it to enter somehow into the miscarriage of the Sefer. Look, the Moadim Balocha is a masterpiece of writing by Reb Zevin. But it's only meant to sort of give you a geschmack to want to go in deeper and give you, like a newspaper articles the way they were. I think here you have a way for people to come into Yomim Tovim and find Torah on the Yontif in many, many ways.
Yeah, I think the more appropriate comparison is to the Tzipes of Frank's Mikroi Kodesh.
Right. In the Hakdama to what I think probably became his most popular work, which is amazing because it really only starts when he's close to, in his 60s and 70s, is the Chuvas V'Hanhagos. And over there, he writes that I am going to be very stark. You have to learn up. You can't be just in Lomdus without Halacha L'maisa. You cannot just go into the Lomdus without going into the Poskim. However, if you really learn up the Rishonim correctly and find these Makairis, you will be able to discover new things in halacha you never saw before. Again, this is a man with a very interesting biography. Born in London, and yet going to Eretz Yisrael at a young age, learning in Hebron, being Makurov to the Briskerov, the Chazon Ish being his Shatchin. There's so many interesting elements here. And starting his various roles as a very sort of a young Rosh Hashiva in different places. And then as he's printing the Mayadim Uzmanim, and it's a big hit, obviously. Everybody has one. It's interesting that when he reaches around, and all the other Sfarim he started to write, by the way, he would take short subjects like Tyrus HaMishpacha, he would write little parts of the Rambam, Hilchas Deus, Hilchas Yisodei Torah, Hilchas Avodah Zarah. He would write his short notes. And then somehow as he gets into the Eidach Haredus, because of, I think, as you say, his very extreme shitas, his anti-Zionist shitas, what happens? I guess he gets a request to go to Johannesburg for a couple of months out of the year and act as an official the Rav of the Johannesburg? I don't think he was the official rabbi of Johannesburg.
No, he had a shul. Yeah, the shul, the right wing of Johannesburg.
And there, of course, he creates a yeshiva. And it's interesting, according to his own testimony, he becomes re-exposed again to Chutz La'aretz life. And he gets re-exposed again to things that aren't the norm in Eretz Yisrael. And he starts writing these ideas down and sending them to his son, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman, in Eretz Yisrael. And the main thrust is it's going to be short and sweet and shakav, similar to a sefer you love, the Shmeres Chaim. In other words, this is good for this door. In other words, he sort of gets it because those pieces in the 8 volumes of Chuvas V'Hanhagos, they're much shorter. They're much shorter, and it gets passed around. And that's what you're going to find people quoting consistently now. All these short, and he mentions he doesn't even work them out completely. He doesn't quote every source. He's not as thorough as even Rav Liebes or others who tried to deal, an American poskim who try to deal with stuff. He says, I'm not going to be masker this. It's based on my notes.
Yeah, I think it's popularized. It's a different than the Chavadas, and it's served to popularize halacha in a different way, which is probably more accessible. Even Chavadas is very accessible. I think Chuvas V'Hanhagos became very accessible. Yeah, you have to, but again, you have to, like I said, certain things he's going to throw them out on you, and that's that you have to understand that's his personality.
In the early 50s, he was close to a Chabad Chassid, Reb Shem Tov, and Reb Shem Tov sent him a letter with a gift for his son's bar mitzvah, and Reb Sternbuch saw in the letter it said that your son should grow in Yerushalayim and Torah. L'nachas ruach of the Rebbe, which at that time, of course, was the recently ensconced Lubavitcher Rebbe. And Rav Sternbuch was put off by this. He said, what? My son should grow up to for the covet of the Rebbe. And he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, I usually don't answer questions from people I don't know.
The Rebbe's answer is fascinating. He says basically that he mentions what the bracha they always give that be a chayil chasi reishamayim lamdan. That's what the bracha they give to every bar mitzvah bacher. I got a letter like that from my bar mitzvah too.
It was Niskayim. The Rebbe's bracha was Niskayim. It was a nest. The Rebbe's bracha was Niskayim by Rabbi Yosef. Yes, go ahead.
So it's interesting. He says that because you're not sure when you go daven, when you're supposed to daven for the right thing, so therefore you can moisten your tefillah to somebody who knows how to daven better, and then moisten their tefillahs to me, although he doesn't say it quite that way, but he writes slight out some nova. But he says basically they're moisten their tefillahs to me that I should daven for the kid, that the kid should go on the richtige Wegen shmi, therefore nachas ruach to me as a form of tefillah. It was a fascinating thing.
Right, yes, it is. And you can see that, again, he through his life, he quotes the Rebbe's father. The question is, in Johannesburg, in other places, where we know, in Memphis, Tennessee, where it would be very difficult to get Chol of Yisrael, he mentions not Rav Moshe, he mentions the Chazon Ish, who already said you could rely on the faculties of the whatever government agency is monitoring to make sure that there is nothing except pure cow milk in the product. He also layers it with two other things. One is the Befus Devart that Meshach Chochmah brings down at the end of Parshas Boy, that for Kabbalah from the Goin, who Rav Sternbuch always prided himself through his mother's side. He was a neched from the Vilna Goin.
Yeah, that drives me. Can I say that drives me crazy when people do that? You know how many relatives, how many descendants the Goyen has nowadays? And especially, it's almost as bad as Nin V'nech Rashi, which some people say. We're all Ashkenazic Jews are descended from Rashi. There's not a single Ashkenazic Jew who's not descended from Rashi. And most, I think 90% of Ashkenazic Jews are descended from the Maharal. And if you're not descended from the Gra, then you're descended from the Gra's brother or from somebody else who lived in Vilna at that time. It's so silly.
Dear listeners, when we sit down to record an episode for the Yeshiva of Newark Podcast Network, we're always mindful of one thing: who's listening and why they keep coming back. We know that you're not just tuning in once. You're coming back episode after episode, and that tells us something important. It means our conversations are resonating with you. That kind of impact is humbling, and it's also a responsibility. Producing content that's thoughtful and accessible takes real effort behind the scenes, from professional editing, production, fact-checking, distribution. Each episode represents an enormous commitment. This has been a free service, complete access without any paywalls for over 6 years and counting. I'm reaching out to invite you to partner with us in sustaining and expanding the Yeshiva of Newark podcast platform. Your support will ensure that our existing podcasts continue at a high level of quality. Listeners have told me that they rely on this content day after day, week after week to stay engaged. Every program has a clearly marked link that you can click on to donate for any amount. I want to thank you and our friends from the IDT Corporation for helping make this possible and for being part of an open-minded, Masorah-conscious, Geschmack Hakarai, sprinkled with authentic Lomdus community. I'm Avram Kivelevich. Thank you. He quotes the Goin that the Takonos Chazal and the rationale behind it is not the whole story. That every single, that the Meshach Chochmah quotes it Lagabi Yontiv Sheni, but it's quoted, the Goin is always evoked there, that it's, even though Chazal give you the Nigla reason, there's other Taimim Kamusim that they didn't want to be Megalit. And he says that the Aruch HaShulchan mentions this as well, that it isn't just about being ma'ariv a chelik, the milk, a cholav of a camel or some other treif animal. There's something more that indicates the shmira between Klal Yisrael and the Goyim, and it goes with the darg of Yayin. And then he quotes, interestingly, the Frierdiker Lubavitcher Rebbe, who said that any person who drinks chol of stam is like kimat ein le chelik to kedushas Yisrael b'chlal.
Yeah, it's interesting to Rayat because all the Hasidim hold this way. This is a mishugas which all the Hasidim possess.
It's one of the many areas which the Hasidim moved the yeshiva belt in their direction, because I would add, since the yeshiva belt did not really have a worldview, they weren't Hershins. So when the Hasidim came in and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" Yeshiva said, "Yeah, well, we'll stop doing it."
Rav Sternbuch is aware, and when he's writing this in Johannesburg, towards the Kehillah, that probably, again, has to pay premium prices. We know Rav Sternbuch was a machmir. Again, I'll mention here before I forget, he has a chumra in Parshas Shkolim that he repeats a number of times, that the bracha is also a chelik of the Kriya, not just by Parshas Zohar, but by Parshas Shkolim as well. He uses a medrash, a tanchuma, that he sometimes quotes as a psikta.
It's fascinating how he gets to that chumrah,
But he says the medrash makes no sense because it says that Moshe Rabbeinu still being mazir when we read Parsha Shkolim, and then he quotes a binyan Shloima who quotes his brother Rav Betzalel Akayin, that the 2 times it says L'chaper al nafshei seichem shows you that reading Parsha Shkolim is a me'ain, a tikkun to be machaper as if we're giving the Shkolim, and that it isn't just a hachroza to remind people at the time of they were giving the Machzah Shekel, that the takana to read Parsha Shkolim is a way that we, without a Beis HaMikdash especially, can somehow be makayim the inyan of Nesinas Machzas HaShekel.
Fairly standard Hasidish thought, right?
But therefore the bracha is makiv, and therefore he says that you should not have a katan have the kriya, because you need to be moitzi everybody. And therefore you should have a gadol getting the aliyah, and you should be able, of course, to hear the bracha. He says, Lu Yitzur, there's a bar mitzvah. Okay, the katan can maybe say the bracha, but definitely the kriya should be done by an adult of Parsha Shkolim. I should say, by the way, just in terms of Parshas Zohar, he has quite a bit of discussion. He quotes the famous Brisker Rov about Mechias, about who is Amalek. The way I've seen it from Rabbi Yosha Ber from Boston, quoting his grandfather, Amalek is, based on the Yerushalmi, is anyone who does the Maisa Amalek. Anyone who's Toifus Maisa Amalek has a din Amalek. And when Rav Sternbuch quotes this, he quotes this as destroying the rishus of the idea of who makes himself Amalek. Very similar to Rav Hirsch, in terms of what does it mean to be Moicha Zecher Amalek. Rav Sternbuch has a tremendous kasha, Rabbi Yosef, which I didn't see anybody else ask. Shol, terrible failure in terms of not killing out, leaving Agag alive and not destroying Amalek. Why didn't David HaMelech get involved? Why didn't Chizkiyo? Why weren't there other Malachim who, now that Klal Yisrael are Miyushiv, why aren't they being Makayim that mitzvah? I never saw that kasha anywhere. And Rav Sternbuch gives this tremendously chap. He says that it's not a mitzvah to kill every Amalek. Rav Sternbuch says, unless you could kill them all, unless you have them all in one place, it's a destruction of the whole nation. And Shaul was the only melech who had them in his gun sights.
No, it's found historically. Based on Tanakh, I understand he baborns it a little bit, but there was one place that Amalek, because we see David a few years later is fighting up. He's Amalek. And yeah, I know he says that they've fled away, but it's not plus shot at all. But it's a good example. It's a great havraka on his part, which of course you can argue with. Minei ubei, convince all his bias and say no, punkt vakir.
Right, but he stirred the pot. And he, in a way that again was quite gishmak in terms of what is the mitzvah mechias Amalek. Let's talk about what I felt was a real effort on his part to, despite his kitzonius on Zionism.
Absolutely not. He's viewed in those circles as a moderate, partially accepting Zionism, fighting with Asra Kadisha on grave diggings in the Meir Shalom world that he inhabited. He didn't live in Meir Shalom, doesn't live there. But in that world, he's a liberal. They made protests outside of his house. The true Kanoim amongst the Kanoim. So if anything, he came across a softie.
His writings on Divrei Hashkafa, which is a nice little packet to get a sense in his mind, he's very stark. He talks about how only the Bnei Torah who come to Eretz Yisrael are zocha to be matzliach and be happy, despite all the labyrinth of crazy things that the Israeli government has, because they're coming for the true purpose of living in Eretz Yisrael. And he talks about again, whether it's the Teimanim or others who have been ruined and destroyed. He does bashmutz the Tzionim.
Nicht Zionis. Again, you have to understand this distinction. He doesn't go to the root of the issue. He has an agudistische criticism of Zionis. Of Zionim, nicht of Zionis. The Isra of Akamas Medina, the head of Eliyahu, Gimel Kamudas, I don't think you'll find it.
Right. He talks about the terrible things they've done.
Yes. That's the liberal position in those circles.
Uh-huh. So you think, I see what Rav Meir is saying. Rav Meir is saying that even though he is a ribald anti the Zionists in power, and he hates the irreligious Zionists, and he feels that they're horrible. He feels that they've destroyed neshamas, and they have hell to pay, and they're going to be in Gehenna and burn forever, and they're horrible.
He's missed the whole issue. He's missed the Iker issue.
Right. He's not against the idea that there is a state. That's what you're saying.
He doesn't discuss that.
But he is definitely, he could show his props about how anti he is. He says better the people who died in the Holocaust, whereas the people who came and were for Brent in Eretz Yisrael, they lost their Olam Haba and they etc. I mean, he made statements like that, and he continued to.
But again, I think our mayor is correct, and I think let's go back to what I said before. He's a hired hand. He's just a figurehead. He was just put there in order to put a litvak in the top of the apparatus, but it's not really his ball game. And it's not really and yes, he's from their perspective, just like when they took Rav Bengus, who was a friend of Rav Kook's, then they had to look the other way. So they took Rabbi Sternbuch, even though he was now no friend of Rav Kook's, but yeah, he's liberal. Some from our perspective, he's a hyped kanoi, but from the inside, he's a moderate. That's a very good insight.
I think this debate over the Kvarim was about some building project in Ramat Beit Shemesh. They discovered the remains of bodies. And the question was, I think Rav Sternbuch held that they were goyim, that they're not metame ba'oyo. And they called in Rav Chaim Kanievsky on this as well, in order to tell people who moved into this shchuna and these buildings are being built that it's no problem. There's no tumas tahoim. There's no issue.
That ended his career in the real commercial circles. He was mamish ungefragt. It was the end of his career.
But weren't both of you moved by the shilas that came from Johannesburg from the Bali Tshuva? There was one fellow whose wife lachtois legamre hilchas nida and tyras hamishpacha, but she said, "I'll do it for you. I'm not being frum. I don't believe in frumkeit, but I'm married to you and I love you, and I want to be able to live together, and I will keep it." And the Baal Tshuva felt he wasn't sure yet, and he came to Rav Sternbuch to feel better whether he can still live with his wife. Not typical of him. He quotes Rav Moshe on this issue, and Rav Moshe came up with chidushim in Kimli based on the Gemara in Ksuvis, that if you know that person and you have this personal connection to them and you feel that's enough for you to be soymech on. And Rav Sternbuch tries hard to see if he can relate that to this man and woman. He doesn't want to separate them, but he's really at the end, Bekoishi, he's not sure he wants Kedei Yisrael, but you can see he's trying to help them. He's not saying, "Oh, Teugnish, you should get a get." In other words, can you realistically say a person who's already on record scoffing at the Soidus of Torah and Torah Shabbal Peh that could have nemonis on a certain Inyan? That's the question. Now, it gets more complex when he had the shaila about people eating by their parents who are Machalei Shabbos, eating kosher or not. And in Johannesburg, he mentions that the expense of getting kosher flesh was extremely high. And he mentions there how, once again, he says, I don't want to have Ava between you and your father. But if your father says he's keeping kosher totally, and he's koshering his house, even though he's Machal Shabbos, and you have nemonis in him, and you have that relationship with him, there Sternbuch says that's all right. You don't have to assume that he's going to, but if he only says he koshers when you come, and it's only when you're there, that's very hard, Rav Sternbuch felt, to be matir, even though it's going to cause great pain between you and your father. And again, I was moved by the fact that he was oimed to this situation, and he didn't want to be mafriya.
I'm curious what you would say about a woman who doesn't cover her hair, because that's another issue like that. But can you eat by which is discussed? I think it's some posts can actually machmir. They say if your relative is the woman does not cover her hair, you can't trust her kashrus.
We have to go back to what Rav Sternbuch writes as sort of his in his natzlus of his svarim, that first of all, they're written without the complete hekif, and secondly, some of them are for Johannesburg, for outside of Eretz Yisrael, for places that have Bali Tshuva and stuff like that. You've got to admit, a psak in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, is not the same psak that you would have in Williamsburg, New York, right?
You get that little league plug in there,
Good side. Again, I was just trying to think of an alliteration, but again, that's just the thing that came to mind. And I think that's part of what the Tshuvas Hanagas sort of underscores, even though he says that I never paskin anything that I didn't think was right, and oiska arbit. He says I'm not into writing svarim just to show off, and I have a chiddush which I think might be true, and I just want to be magavev rayas to it.
Although you might be correct, it might have been contextual.
There's a shita that you have to, that Rav Bishis Mamei because is part of the ikar of Amunah Bias Mashiach. And in my opinion, I've read many people who say that, including evidently Rabbi Sternbuch, and in the shtickle sent me, it's clearly a mistake.
In other words, the kimiyah for the geula, it isn't enough that you believe there's going to be a period of great messianic period. You have to actually actively hope and daven for it and feel that you want it to come and you want to actualize it.
No, yes, they believe it's going to come today. So they're clearly explicit Gemara. So they talk about Mashiach's not coming for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, right? The Rishonim who say that they give dates in the future, right? And the Gemara talks about you have to it's only going bel b'tshuva. So all these people, and they say the name of the Brisker Rav that he has done this way. I don't believe the Brisker Rav actually said it. It's a portion that Alfi Shizmei is a din in Tzipis Yeshua. As it's one of the din and one of the things that questions
that you're asked after May of Esrim.
Right. So we throw in, why we leave Mashiach, not that we're mitzapel Yeshua. That's part and part of our belief.
It's not a chelik in the Emunah and Bias HaMashiach. That's what you're saying.
Right. They say Rabbi Zalman once gave a shir, and then next day somebody came and told him a chiddush. Rabbi Zalman said, "It's a nice chiddush. What's your hechrech to say it?" So the guy went to Pachi Nefesh. So then they went to ask Rabbi Zalman, "But you said the same chiddush yesterday in shir." So Rabbi Zalman said, "I had a hechrech. I had to say a shir. What hechrech? He didn't have to say a shir. What hechrech did he have to say it?" So if you want to write a sefer, and we know you have a hechrech to come with chidushim in order to write the sefer. So sometimes it seems that way that people need to write a sefer, so if they put out chidushim in order to say shalom and they'll stop him raking.
I'm going to take Sternbuch at his word that he tries to be as honest as possible according to what he believes. I don't know if he was just trying to be mafalpal, and I think he sort of indicates where he's not 100% sure. Let's end today with one of your favorite subjects, Rabbi Yosef. Rav Sternbuch has, I think, a very definitive and important tshuva about brach on presidents. And we know shecholok mikvoidei lebasar v'dam is a bracha when you see a melech, even a melech of a non-Jewish melech. So Rav Sternbuch was asked about the president of South Africa, and of course he says, I remember when the president of the United States visited Israel, and there was a question about whether to make a bracha on Nixon or not. Rav Sternbuch said there were Rabbanim who said yes, and Rav Sternbuch felt no. He said he was impeached, right? But he resigned before the charges were brought. Correct. Right. So anyway, Rav Sternbuch pointed to that as the Raya Brura that this is not Malchus that is lasting. There's time limits, and he can be taken out of office. He can be voted out, and he can also be impeached and taken out. Moshe Einkein, Rav Sternbuch said, and that's for sure true, he says, and Rameir, this is a little gift for you. This is for sure true about the president of South Africa, where he said there's a whole element. He says the blacks in South Africa don't even b'chalal goyrus that the president means anything, and therefore there's for sure no sense of covet that he has the covet of malchus to them. He says there's a whole section. Look at the tshuva. He says there's a whole section of the country that is not even goyrus him as being significant. But he says the Queen of England, however, you can make a bracha with shemu malchus on the Queen of England, despite the fact that she does not really involve herself in actually any of the legal ins and outs of the daily life of her citizens. But since every law is subject to her seal, and it's all in the way Her Majesty's official rule, therefore, the Queen of England and King Charles, the one who he received the letter from, had he not just received the letter, it's possible he would make a bracha. However, Rav Sternbuch says it could be you have to see the king as a melech. In other words, a personal invitation when you're going into his private chambers. Is he seen with all his regalia of melech? And there Rav Sternbuch is not so sure. And therefore he wonders the people who gathered outside of Buckingham Palace, who would wait for Queen Elizabeth to open the window and wave, and then make a bracha when they saw her hand. He wondered if that really was halakhically realistic or not.
One of the aspersions that Jews cast on Queen Elizabeth, perhaps justifiably so, is that she visited all the former British colonies in the world except for Israel. She never visited Israel. So, but could be that we can it's close on her, that she didn't want all the Jews in Israel to have a suffix whether to make a brach on her or not. And therefore she didn't come in order not to put us all into this situation.
Very good. Rav Sternbuch bewarns that don't worry about his staklus. Don't worry about his staklus because you don't have to look at her. You just have to be in the uvda where she is appearing and with her koyach hamalchus. So I think we've given here a little bit of a sketch of what Rav Sternbuch has done in his 10 decades.
He's incredibly prolific, and he's a tremendous contributor tremendously, as I said, whether the contribution is because of what he says or what you can argue on, and it should be a tremendous chus for him.
If his handlers and the Eida Charedis official people are listening to Rizcha Daraisa, please let him just
go out and look at his monument and argue what he has to say.
And let him be alone in his room and get him a good chavrusa. Do not wheel the man out for these horrible photo ops. All it does is Nebuch detract from his towering accomplishments. We'll catch you, B'yat Hashem, next time. Take care, my friends. Thanks for listening. And remember about that donation link in the episode show notes. And if you liked what you heard, share it with your friends. Today's episode was produced by me, Avram Kivelevich, with audio production from Eretz Yisrael, Artseinu Akdosha, by Ben Wallach of Experience Audio. It was edited with love by Tzvi Gordon. Catch you next time. Shalom uvracha.